Visualize this if you will. A prison ship braving the waters off Australia, carrying 150 women until one fateful night. Disaster strikes. By dawn, wreckage floats on the waves and cries for help fade into the wind. This is the haunting story of the Neva, a convict transport ship whose loss in 1835 remains one of history's most chilling maritime tragedies. Thank you for joining us at the Shipwreck Sirens Sea Stories, as we look at the Neva, a vessel tasked with transporting prisoners from Ireland to Australia, part of a system designed to expand Britain's colonial reach. But her journey was far from ordinary. The Neva, facing treacherous seas and an unforgiving coastline, suffered a grim fate that would claim the lives of most aboard. Today we'll unravel the events surrounding her tragic end, through the eyes of our historical composite we have named Sarah O'Connell. We envisioned her as typical of the imprisoned females heading toward a challenging life in a far-flung penal colony near the bottom of the world. Now let's explore this harrowing story of a ship that sailed to her doom. The transport, a three-masted bark of 327 tons, was built in Hull, England, in 1813. Though she had once carried convicts to Australia without incident, this voyage would be her last. Commanded by Captain Benjamin Peck, the boat departed Cork, Ireland, on January 8, 1835. On board were 150 female prisoners, 33 children, 9 free women, and 26 crew members. The Neva's voyage was fraught with challenges from the start. As a convict transport ship, she was heavily laden, with limited space for her passengers and crew. The conditions on board were harsh, overcrowding, inadequate provisions, and the constant threat of disease made the journey perilous even before the ship left port. However, for months the Neva sailed uneventfully, rounding the Cape of Good Hope. Although the Neva paused for fresh supplies, the most significant challenge lay ahead: the unpredictable seas of the Southern Hemisphere. As the Neva approached the coast of Tasmania, she faced the Bass Strait, infamous for its treacherous currents and sudden storms. For a vessel already pushed to its limits, it was a gamble between survival and catastrophe. In the early hours of May 13th, the night was heavy with tension, the Neva pitching violently as waves clawed at her hull. Sarah O'Connell, a young Irish woman from Cork on her way to serve a lengthy sentence for crimes that sheer desperation had forced her into, lay awake in her narrow berth, the air below decks thick with the uneasy murmurs of transportees too restless to sleep. The groan of timbers beneath her was louder than usual, and for a moment she closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer to be back in Ireland, safe and sound, and having never stolen food to assuage her constant hunger. Above deck, the lookout's cry pierced the wind. "Land ahead!" Captain Peck, stationed by the wheel, stiffened at the warning. "Adjust course to the north," he ordered. The crew scrambled, their movements frantic under the faint glow of lanterns. The ship's sails strained, but the swells were relentless, driving the Neva closer to danger. It was just past 3 in the morning when the dreaded call erupted. "Breakers ahead!" The ship struck with a sickening lurch, the force of the collision knocking Sarah from her bunk. She hit the floor hard, her breath stolen by the impact. The sound of splintering wood and muffled screams echoed through the transport as the Neva's rudder was ripped away. Moments later, a loud crack reverberated through the hold as the prison stanchions, vertical metal bars designed to confine the convicts, already strained by months of wear and now weakened by the collision, gave way. "What's happening?" a convict wailed, clutching at Sarah as she tried to stand. Sarah gritted her teeth, pushing through the chaos. "We need to get out of here," she shouted, her voice drowned out by the rising din as chaos broke loose instantly. Offenders spilled into the narrow corridors, screaming and crying as they scrambled for the ladder to the upper level. Her heart pounding, Sarah found herself swept up in the panicked surge. Beside her, Mary, a Cockney pickpocket she had befriended, clutched her arm, her face pale, and tears glistened in her eyes. "Sarah, what's happening, love? Are we sinking?" Sarah swallowed hard, her voice trembling. She said, "Just stay with me, Mary," before pulling her toward the ladder. Around them, the former captives surged toward the only escape, some clawing over one another in a desperate attempt to reach the outside. Cries of terror echoed off the wooden beams, mingling with the ominous groans of the ship. The two women clawed their way to the main deck, emerging into a scene of pure pandemonium. The Neva, rudderless and battered, was helpless against the fury of the sea. Crew members shouted orders, their voices hoarse and frantic, but the howling wind and crashing surf eclipsed their words. Convicts clung to railings or each other, their faces masks of fear. Mothers wept as they held their children close, trying to shield them from the spray. One woman fell to her knees, screaming prayers to a god she feared would not answer. Another simply stood frozen, her face awash with terror, unable to move as the sea raged in its assault on the Neva. Near the quarterdeck, Captain Peck was issuing commands to his first officer. "Lower the boats! Quickly!" The first pinnace hit the water but was swamped almost immediately, the towering waves swallowing it whole. A second lifeboat was overwhelmed just as it cleared the rails, capsizing under the weight of terrified passengers. Women clung to the sides, screaming, only to be torn away by the current. Sarah staggered forward, her feet slipping on the slick timber. "Mary, hold on to me," she called, but Mary had been swept into the frenzied crowd surging toward the longboat. Another wave slammed into the Neva, sending the young convict sprawling. She grabbed hold of a railing just as a crack of thunder split the night, followed by the deafening sound of the foremast collapsing. The mast crashed onto the deck, scattering debris and bodies alike. A woman nearby screamed as a jagged shard of wood grievously injured her leg, leaving her crumpled on the deck, her cries lost in the ensuing bedlam. Around Sarah, women screamed prayers, curses, or incoherent pleas as the scene descended further into turmoil. The inmates, now free from the shattered stanchions, in inexplicable madness, had raided the government stores on the poop deck. A woman staggered toward Sarah, her hands trembling as she held out a tin cup filled with rum from a burst barrel. "Drink this. It'll save you," she cried, her voice cracking with hysteria. Sarah shoved the cup away. "No, it won't. I must survive. That's going to take a clear head," she hollered. But the woman clutching the cup like a lifeline was already staggering back toward the commotion, the rum spilling over the rim. The Irishwoman's chest tightened as she watched in horror as more gave in to gulping down the fiery liquid in frantic desperation. Some slumped where they stood, their legs giving way as the liquor took hold. Already too drunk to steady themselves, others were swept away by the water crashing over the deck. Another swell slammed into the Neva, and the planking beneath Sarah's feet tilted violently. She fell hard, her breath knocked from her lungs. Struggling to her knees, she caught sight of Captain Peck still near the quarterdeck, gripping the remnants of a railing. His face was a mask of dire resolve. For a fleeting moment their eyes met. "Hold on to anything you can," he roared, his voice raw but commanding. The words rang in her ears as she scrambled toward a capstan. Around her the ship groaned and splintered, the hull fracturing under the relentless pounding of the waves. The Neva shuddered violently, the sound of shattering wood vibrating through the air like cannon fire. Failing to make the capstan, Sarah clutched a jagged fragment of railing, her knuckles white, as the deck beneath her feet tilted sharply once more. The groaning timbers, warped by the relentless pounding of the sea, gave one final loud crack, and she began to break apart. The world became chaos. The bow tore away with a great lurch, dragging screaming prisoners and crew into the swirling abyss. Sarah stumbled, her breath catching in her throat as she fell to her knees on what remained of the tilting deck for a second time. All around her the ocean churned with fragments of the Neva, barrels, beams, and jagged splinters of hull, tossed about like toys in the storm. A woman's piercing scream rang out nearby, cutting through the cacophony. Sarah turned her head just in time to see the poop deck housing the drunken women collapse entirely. Those not claimed in the collapse were sent sliding into the roiling water. Others clung for their lives to the wreckage, their faces frozen in terror, while others were swept under, their cries abruptly silenced. "Help me!" a voice shrieked over the chaos. Sarah's gaze darted to a convict frantically clawing at a barrel, her hair plastered across her face. The woman's fingers slipped, her head disappearing beneath the swells as Sarah stared helplessly, unable to move. Yet another wave slammed into the remains of the Neva, washing over Sarah and tearing at her grip on the fragment of the railing. It was carried away, but another piece of timber came her way, and she latched onto it. Water surged into her mouth and nose, stinging her eyes as she coughed and sputtered. Her fingers burned with the effort to hold on, but the cold had already begun to seep deep into her bones, dulling her senses and stiffening her limbs. She could barely feel the timber beneath her fingertips. She turned her head toward the longboat. It was the last intact lifeboat, teetering dangerously as crew members tried to steady it. Convicts swarmed around the edges, their hands reaching desperately for safety. "Back away! Hold it steady!" a sailor shouted, his voice hoarse and panicked, but his words were drowned by the roar of the sea and the pleading cries of women fighting to escape the doomed transport. No sooner had it launched and barely cleared the Neva's side than a monstrous wave rose from the darkness like a black wall, crashing down with ferocious force. The longboat tipped violently, spilling its passengers into the freezing water. Sarah's stomach clenched as she watched bodies tumble like rag dolls, their screams carried away by the wind. The Neva spasmed again, its stern heaving upward as the entire hull began to split. Sarah gritted her teeth as the remaining exiles and crew scrambled for any piece of debris they could find. Soaked and trembling, one woman reached out to Sarah, her hand brushing her shoulder before another wave ripped her away. The thunderous crack of the quarterdeck breaking loose drew Sarah's gaze upward. Peck was still there, gripping a splintered beam with both hands as the stern began to tilt. His voice rose above the howling wind, steady and commanding despite the desperation in his tone. "Hold on, keep fighting." The prison transport gave one last tortured groan, and the Neva was no more. The stern tilted sharply before it disappeared beneath the waves. The timber she clung to bobbed violently on the surface, her numb fingers gripping it with all the strength she had left. Her arms trembled, her muscles burning with the effort. Around her, the ocean swallowed the cries of the living. A convulsing sob escaped her lips as another wave dragged her under. Salt water filled her nose and mouth, stinging her throat as she kicked mightily, regaining the surface. The timber slipped from her grasp, and for a terrifying moment she was adrift, her limbs flailing weakly in the chilly embrace. But the current pushed her back, and her fingers again found the timber. She clung to it as the minutes stretched into eternity, her breaths coming in uneven gasps and her vision blurred by exhaustion. Somewhere in the distance, the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, a faint, mocking glow against the endless horizon. Sarah's chest heaved as she gasped for air, her strength fading with every passing moment. She tightened her grip on the timber, her knuckles raw, and her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Not yet," she whispered. "Not yet." By dawn, the Neva had been reduced to scattered wreckage, drifting aimlessly in the waters of the Bass Strait. Still, there were those who survived and remained fighting. 2 makeshift rafts had formed from sections of the shattered deck. Sarah had found her way to one of them and was now clinging to its side, her fingers bleeding from gripping the broken wood. Around her, the survivors were silent save for the occasional gasp or sob, their voices long since lost to the relentless wind. The waves towering above the raft, like predators stalking prey, continued their assault. Each crest seemed poised to smash the fragile remnant into the depths below. The skipper among the survivors, steadfast as ever, braced himself against the mast stump jutting from the raft, shouting hoarse instructions that few could follow. One by one, the others began to falter. A man was swept away, his cries fading almost instantly. A convict woman lost her grip moments later, her small child slipping into the waves beside her. Her heart clenched at the sight, but Sarah had no strength left to scream. Her arms burned with the effort of holding on, her nails digging into the timber. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she refused to let go. She had come too far. She would not give in. Hours passed, though time had lost all meaning. The battered and broken raft began to drift toward King Island's desolate shore. Through salt-encrusted eyes, Sarah spotted the faint outline of sand, and for the first time, hope flickered in her chest. But before anyone could rejoice, a rogue wave rose behind them. It came with a ferocity that stole the breath from her lungs. The wave slammed into the raft, flipping it like a leaf in a storm. Sarah was torn away, her numb legs kicking desperately. Her hand found a fragment of the raft, and she clung to it with the last of her strength. When her feet finally scraped against the sand, the fight seemed over. She dragged herself onto the beach, coughing and choking on seawater. Her arms gave out, and she collapsed face down in the wet sand, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her breaths were shallow and ragged, each one a battle in its own right. Around her, others staggered ashore, some falling to their knees in exhaustion, others too weak to move at all. Of the handful numbering 22 who reached King Island alive, 7 would not survive before their ultimate salvation. King Island offered little in the way of refuge. The castaways stumbled onto the barren, windswept shore, greeted by nothing but scrubby bushes and jagged rocks. Though weakened, Captain Peck rallied the group, dividing them into tasks. Some scoured the wreckage for supplies, retrieving a few barrels of flour and salt pork. Others gathered driftwood and fragments of the ship to construct a crude shelter against the howling wind. Soon the air was thick with the stench of salt and decay as bodies from the wreck washed ashore, scattered among the debris. Sarah, though weak, forced herself to help. Together, the stranded gathered the remains of their shipmates, burying 95 bodies in shallow makeshift graves. Each burial was a reminder of the cost of their survival, each grave a silent monument to lives lost. The air was heavy with grief, but there was no time for mourning. Each day was a battle. They rationed their meagre provisions, stretching a handful of flour into a thin, watery gruel. But the nights were the worst. The cold seeped into Sarah's bones, wrapping her like a shroud. Hunger gnawed at her insides worse than it ever had in Ireland when she had been forced to steal it, and her lips cracked and bled from thirst. Sarah's once fiery resolve began to waver as the days stretched into nights of biting cold and gnawing hunger. The memories of her past, once a source of strength, now haunted her. She thought of the bread she had stolen and the chain of events that had led her to this desolate island. Each pang of hunger felt like a cruel reminder of her crime. When one of the survivors offered her a crust of bread, she shook her head weakly. "Food took me from Ireland and put me on this beach," she murmured, her voice frail. "Give it to someone else, someone who still has a chance." Soon Sarah's body could take no more. She lay still on the damp earth, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Once filled with fire and determination, her eyes now stared blankly at the grey sky above. The others gathered around her, their faces etched with sorrow. Mary, who had also survived against all odds, remained close to Sarah during their time on King Island. Despite her own injuries, she helped gather firewood and even found a tattered blanket among the wreckage. On the 11th day, Mary approached Sarah, who lay motionless in the shelter. "You can't give up, love," she whispered, brushing Sarah's matted hair from her face. "We've made it this far. Don't let it end like this." Sarah's lips moved, but no sound came. Mary clasped her hand, tears streaming down her face. Her final breath came quietly, carried away by the wind. Sarah O'Connell, who had fought so hard, was gone. Her body was laid to rest beside the others, her name lost to time, but her struggle forever etched into the island's lonely sands. God, please welcome her. She was a good soul, Mary whispered. You deserve better than this, lass. 2 weeks passed before salvation arrived, though for some, like Sarah, it came too late. A party from the Tartar, another shipwrecked vessel, discovered the survivors while combing the island's coastline. Their arrival was a moment of bittersweet relief. They brought food and guidance, leading those who still lived to the hut of a sealer, John Scott, whose dogs hunted wallabies to feed the starving castaways. On the morning of June 15th, the faint outline of a ship appeared on the horizon. The survivors' cries of astonishment turned to shouts of joy as the schooner Sarah Ann, under Charles Friend's command, drew closer. For the survivors, the sight of a ship in the distance was a miracle they had scarcely dared to hope for. "Signal her!" Peck rasped, his voice hoarse from days of shouting into the wind. They waved scraps of cloth tied to driftwood, their ragged forms silhouetted against the rising sun. When the Sarah Ann anchored off the shore, her crew worked tirelessly to ferry the survivors aboard. Each step onto the schooner's deck felt like a miracle, but even rescue could never erase the tragedy from their souls. 3 survivors, 2 men and 1 woman, had been out hunting when the Sarah Ann departed. They were left behind, stranded on the island for days longer until the cutter Charlotte arrived to bring them home. The wreck of the Neva claimed 224 lives, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in Australian history. Of the 239 aboard, only 15 survived to tell the tale. As we have seen for the survivors, the wreck was not the end of their torment, but the beginning of a harrowing journey of survival. Sarah's story, which we have fashioned, is one of many threads in the tapestry of a tragedy that still resonates nearly 2 centuries later. Though all the names of those she was intended to represent may not appear in the historical records, those who struggled to survive no matter their crimes, we can pay tribute to the courage, desperation, and humanity of all who faced the unforgiving sea that night. Even as late as the last 10 years, the wreck still looms large. In 2016, Hobart-based artist Catherine Stringer created an exhibition titled Neva Reliquary, featuring garments made from seaweed collected at the wreck site. This work serves as a tribute to the lives lost in the disaster. As for King Island itself, it still bears the scars of the Neva's wreck, its windswept shores a silent witness to the lives lost there. And while the sands have long since reclaimed the graves of the fallen, their story endures, as it does for those who never reached the shore as the living or the dead, lost souls who share the same melancholy epitaph. The sea is my grave is the sea. Thank you for joining us. It's time to cast off now, but if you would enjoy more dramatized retellings, please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe so we may bring you more harrowing tales of the sea. And be sure to check out more of our other maritime content on this channel.